Good morning. Thank you again for taking the time to present. It's Mark Schumacher at UCSF. I'm a committee member. In terms of gathering information about the process, there's been a focus on the post-marketing phase and surveillance of opioids, especially the extended release opioids. It's sort of an open question to any of the panel members, but I think there's a void in understanding what's currently being done with post-marketing surveillance and how that could help us, lead us in part out of the current predicament with the overprescribing of opioids. Thank you.
Yeah, so probably there are two pieces, and I'm sure I'm missing things that others will. So there is a standard requirement that manufacturers that have products on the market conduct post-marketing surveillance, and there's reporting requirements for specific kinds of adverse events and things when those occur. And every year, manufacturers are required to submit an annual report. And one aspect of that is to talk about whether or not anything's come to their attention that alters the benefit risk and the overall use of the product. So that's a sort of general thing. Another general requirement that people have is after approval, and Josh, maybe you mentioned this, after approval, there's a statutory requirement that after 10,000 prescriptions or 18 months, we have to perform a formal review of the safety data that have emerged since the products come on the market. One aspect of that relates to abuse and misuse and those kinds of things. So those are the sort of standard things that product-specific review occurs under. There's also general surveillance that the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology conduct all of the time. And in the opioid space, we have an epidemiology group that is only working on opioids. Their job is to monitor opioid safety, opioid trends in use, and those kinds of things. And so there's an overarching review, I guess I would say, non-product specific review. And then now that I'm thinking, there's a third aspect. Under some circumstances, we require manufacturers to conduct research, targeted research under what's called post-marketing requirements, and those are required, under statutory, penalty of monetary fines and those kinds of things. And there are a number of studies, and we can get you that information, that are ongoing in the opioid space, where manufacturers are being required to conduct studies to get us information we don't have right now. So I'd say lots of different layers of ways we're trying to collect information, from the standard ways we would to more targeted ways related to post-marketing requirements about things we know about opioids.
John Calkins, Carnegie Mellon, committee member. Thanks for the great talks. The vaccines situation is an intriguing parallel, where there's a division of labor, or a partnership, that you described with CDC. In thinking about pharmaceuticals for which there is an active black market, is there or should there be some division or labor or partnership with some other entity? And in answering that, I'd like to give you permission to answer it not just under current statutes, but also to allow yourself to think about the possibility of a change in statutes.
Well, so there is that division already. Diversion and misuse of controlled substances is statutorily given over to the DEA. So it is excluded from from our remit as far as pre-marketing and things like that, and specifically given to them. The good news is we have a really good working relationship with them. I talked to Lou Milioni, who's the head of the diversion control group there, pretty much on a weekly basis. We do include aspects of that in some of the things that you heard from the two talks. So in a sense, we're able to talk to them when issues come up around diversion of these products. Now, is there value in changing that balance? I think the more, my own personal perspective would be, the more valuable thing for us to do is to make greater use of the current resources. So we are currently using that collaboration, I'll call it, between us and the DEA. We may be able to be making better use of that. So for instance, there are databases that are that they have that collect information about these products. I'm not sure myself that we always make the fullest use of those databases. So that'd be one example of the kind of thing I think we might be able to improve.
Hi, are you someone else going to? Valerie Reyna Cornell, member of the committee. Just a comment on the decision models. I assume that we are also encouraging the evaluation of these models empirically, both for construct validity and predictive validity. But that's just a comment. My question has to do with the consideration of the individual patient decision-making perspective versus population perspective. And in particular, just to give a hypothetical example, in an antibiotic situation. Imagine a patient is declining rapidly, so they're likely to die. And you have an antibiotic that is, say, 30% chance of addressing the issue and forestalling death. That does not strongly support, it doesn't substantially support the use of an antibiotic. It's not more than a 50% probability that it will help the patient. So based on a population perspective and the language that we just saw, this would be, I guess, technically contraindicated for the use of the antibiotic. But from an individual decision-making perspective, if the alternative is death and you have a 30% probability, that's at least a shot. And the reason I say this has to do with some theoretical perspectives on decision-making that I'm working on, but I'm also just interested in the broader question of population versus individual decision-making.
Well, I'm not sure I have a clear answer to that. I think, in some ways it's a reflection more than a question. But I think you're right. I think that there are times where what makes sense in an individual clinical setting may be different than what makes sense from a population perspective. And obviously the population exposure is the sum of individual exposures, right? That's kind of the tough part of it. And
on average. Yeah.
Right, on average. No, I think that I would just say to that, I think you've captured the nub of the dilemma right there. I think that it's wholly understandable that an individual clinician might say, under these circumstances, really in effect taking into account the severity of the illness, right? One of the elements in FDA's rubric, that you might make this decision. It is, after all, only one patient. But we're charged, I think, with something a little bit broader than that. And obviously FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine. And I think that's where it gets difficult. We have the advice on the vaccine side from the advisory committee. There's not really anything quite analogous to this other than, I suppose, the CDC's prescribing guidelines that we have on the opioid side.
I agree. I mean, that is the crux of the matter. But let's make it harder. So now you have to make a decision. I mean, in a sense, the FDA is being asked to use those data and then come to a decision about a specific product with that 30% in hand or whatever it is. So that is the challenge before the committee here, is to give us some help about how to make a concrete decision in that setting rather than I don't know, punting or something. I mean, it is a real challenge.
Yeah, just to add an anecdote, which is some 5-6 years ago, not longer actually by now, 10 years ago, there was an article in the New York Times about the Hpv vaccine. And there was a group of folks who were skeptical about it and wondering if it worked and worrying about risks and so forth. And there was a mother who was talking about whether or not she would allow her child to be vaccinated, because you're supposed to be vaccinated, in the early teens. And her quote was, "I refuse to sacrifice my child for the common good." That was her quote. And I thought that it was a remarkably succinct statement of exactly the dilemma that we face, because unquestionably the common good, based on the data presented to us at the agency, would be advanced by her child being vaccinated. The probability that her child herself will benefit is actually small. And she just could not make the jump from the risk to her child as she saw it. And of course, we don't think those risks are very large, but she could not make that jump from there to the benefit on a population level.
Good afternoon, Hortensia Amaro, University of Southern California, member of the committee. I wanted to come back to the issue of clearly development of medications for treatment of addiction, in this case opiates, is a really important part of our toolkit. And Dr. Volkov mentioned that one of the obstacles has been the endpoint of abstinence. And I wondered if you could share with us what the process is for determining that endpoint and how that compares to endpoints for other chronic conditions that you may be considering medications for. So in this case, something like abstinence would be equivalent to like full recovery from a chronic condition. So just wondering if you could reflect on that.
Hi. So as Dr. Volkow mentioned, we have asked for a specific outcome for new therapies to treat opioid substance use disorder, but have also said that we would be willing to consider other endpoints as long as we can understand what the clinical benefit is. So for instance, in the setting of alcohol abuse, we don't require complete abstinence. We have an outcome of number of heavy drinking days because there were data that were made available through studies and different sources that showed that there was a clinical benefit. So it's just harder to do so in the context of different types of substance use disorders.
And I'll answer in the general. This is exactly the same approach we use for every therapeutic within the FDA. So you can go back to AZT development for HIV. We needed to understand the nature of the surrogate that was used there. Did it translate to a clinical benefit we could describe? Obviously it did. Obviously assessed it, and we obviously approved the products. But that is precisely the approach we are told to take.
Hi, Paul Jarris, Marshall Times Foundation. Looking back on this, this has been many years in development, and now we're describing an epidemic. We must have missed a lot of signals along the way. What mechanisms were there in place that could have picked up the signals that something was happening, creating this epidemic? What wasn't in place that should be? And then what was in place that didn't work? I know it's a really general question, but it may be another drug, a total different thing in 10 years that creeps up on us that was unanticipated like this.
Well, I'm not sure it's quite fair to say that we didn't see it happening. I'm not sure that isn't so. I mean, I think you saw Dr. Volkov presented certain data that you go back and to 2005, and you wouldn't have any difficulty saying that things were going up. So I think there are a number of surveillance systems that we have that identified this as happening. I think they have limitations of various kinds. One of the things we have the hardest time with is knowing which particular drug is at the heart of an overdose. So drug-specific information is very often a problem, and in particular, the demise of the Dawn program, which did provide us with that kind of information, has been a limitation. There have been efforts to replace it, but so far not successful. But I would tend to say that just based on the material that Dr. Volkov presented, there were enough warning signals quite some time ago. The question is coming up with approaches that have been commensurate to the problem, and obviously we've done our best. But the nature of it is, as Dr. Volkov again said, is that because of the nature of addiction itself, it tends to feed on itself, it tends to build on itself. And then people can even transition onto other kinds of products, so it's devilishly hard.
I guess I'd argue even 2005 was too late, because the medical examiners were kicking out reports to us every month about the prescription opioid dose killing more than street drugs. And so they had, by 2003, when I got involved, they totally accepted this as that's the way it was. So, I mean, I just think it's worth looking at even further back. And you're right, what do we do once we see a signal may be the real problem.
Hi, Aaron Kesselheim from Brigham Women's Hospital, and also a committee member. So I was interested in the slide that Dr. Lloyd put up about the framework that has apparently been in place since 2012 or so. And so I guess I was wondering, is that framework one that each FDA reviewer uses when they evaluate a drug, and do they fill in those boxes, and are those things then made part of the drug review process that are then made publicly available that we're able to see? So or is that an aspirational sort of framework that people are using? And I guess, are there any examples of that framework being used, and sort of where we could see what sorts of considerations are placed in any of the boxes? And then, as a sort of a supplementary question, while we're thinking of particular examples, it just sort of seems like this kind of general approach that you described was not really applied in the case of Zohydro when it was approved. And so I guess I'm just interested in whether or not you think that was whether it was actually applied, and I'm mistaken, or whether or not it wasn't applicable in that case, or whether or not there's been a change in approach since that point.
So I can start with the process, and Josh can fill in. The process was agreed to under PDUFA 5. So that was what you saw was the beginnings of the implementation of the process. The agreement was to begin with the new molecular entities, and that's been the work that's been done to date. It turns out that for the formal use of this product, we have not had new molecular entities from opioids. As you know, Aaron, I mean, there are a handful of non-new molecular entities, and they account for the vastest proportion of the use of the opioids. So it has not been applied formally, is my understanding, in the division. On the other hand, in other divisions where there are new molecular entities, our expectation is that it is being used by the reviewers, that it is formally part of that review process. We're planning on PDUFA 6, or the next iteration of discussion, extends that use and furthers that implementation. And I guess we can get you the letter, but I mean, presuming that that's approved by Congress and things, the expectation is we'll broaden the use of this to more fully, formally use that as a part of our discussions during review.
Again, David Clark, I'm a committee member, Stanford University. It's already come up in the presentations this morning that the durability of the analgesic effect from opioids is somewhat in question over time. Tolerance is one issue, hyperalgesia is another. There are probably mechanisms that we haven't yet discovered which limit the utility. The period of time over which most opioids are tested prior to their approval is relatively limited compared to what we would anticipate to be the duration of use in the setting of chronic pain. So I wondered if the FDA had considered this difference between testing and the likely clinical duration of use, and whether, with the outcomes perhaps not being particularly encouraging for long-term efficacy, if any creative solutions have been considered that you could share with the committee.
Hi, I think I can address that in a couple of ways. First of all, we have a series of post-marketing requirements that have been put into place for the class of extended release and long-acting opioids, which are indicated for use in chronic settings. And one of those is specifically going to look at the potential impact of hyperalgesia and the ongoing use of opioids. So that study is underway. It's a challenging study to conduct because of a number of issues, but it will take some time for that study to accrue enough patients to meet its objectives, but it is underway. I hear that there's no evidence that opioids work beyond 3 months all the time. And we actually have a fair amount of evidence that they do, just not in the standard format. So first, why don't we have year-long studies of analgesics? Because that would be a great way to really put the question to rest. And the challenge is, this is not just true for analgesics, but it is a particular challenge for this area. Maintaining patients in a randomized, controlled study is very challenging in the setting of analgesics because people have pain and they want it treated. And by the time they have pain that is of great enough severity to warrant around-the-clock opioid treatment, they're generally not willing to stay on a less effective therapy, placebo, or even a less effective active drug. So trying to keep people enrolled in even a 12-week study is extremely difficult. So we allow use of rescue medication, and we have a variety of ways of collecting information about pain over time to try and minimize that effect, but also take the amount of rescue use into account. So over 12 weeks, we typically will have a number of subjects who will discontinue. We've tried a couple of enrichment designs, which also come under a fair amount of criticism, but they do help retain subjects in the study, so we actually have more data, less missing data. Those of you involved in clinical trials know the missing data problem can be quite have quite an impact on the ability to interpret the outcome. But in support of the enriched study designs is during the open label enrollment, when we do have a lot of people who don't meet the enrichment criteria, we put that percentage in the label. So off the bat, prescribers will know X percent couldn't even meet the randomization criteria. Of those who could, then we convey the outcome. And that's with a 12-week study. So trying to do this for a year is basically going to mean we're going to have potentially more missing data than actual completers. But, so how do I possibly say that, that there's evidence? And that's because for a lot of these studies, the population enrolled has been on opioids around the clock for a long time. Then, after a period of months to sometimes years, these people get enrolled into the studies, and then they're in a controlled setting where they're randomized to be on the new study drug, which is an opioid, so a continuation of opioid therapy in some form, or not. And even in that setting, after 12 weeks of a randomized period, we can see a difference between people who are enrolled and are randomized to the active treatment and those who are on placebo and getting rescue. So I think that there's this evidence that we're actually looking now to see how we can formally create an analysis that can speak to this, so that it's not just me up here, but that we can actually create some more definitive data. So we know that, and we know that in the context of these people being tapered off their drugs and then retitrated, which has in it elements that might speak to withdrawal or not, hyperalgesia or not, but also people who are converted without a withdrawal period and then randomized to stay on or not. And we're extremely concerned about the effects of withdrawal and hyperalgesia and all these different things mimicking return of pain. So unlike other randomized withdrawal studies, instead of simply randomizing and looking at return to baseline, we don't allow assessment of efficacy until 12 weeks later. So all of the initial effects of the randomized withdrawal piece for those who get placebo are done earlier in the study. And then they're maintained on their randomized assigned treatment for the 12 weeks, and then we look. So in contrast to other drug classes where the withdrawal phenomenon is not easily confounded with the underlying symptom, they'll just do a return to baseline or a return of what the symptom is. But we recognize that we have some overlapping symptoms in withdrawal and pain, so we get past that period where there could be confounding and get out to 12 weeks and then do our efficacy assessment. So that's one approach, is we've basically redesigned how these studies get done in order to get as much information as possible. And so we are moving forward that way. So I think there's evidence, it's just not well described, and that's on us, I think, now to try and move that part of the conversation forward. In case you're wondering then, why do we try and use placebo and why don't we use active controlled non-inferiority designs? That's because, again, unlike other therapeutic areas, we rely pretty much only on patient-reported outcomes. We don't have an objective measurement of pain. So what we can sometimes see is even in study situations where we have known analgesics in patients with pain, we see studies fail. We don't see a treatment effect. So if we have only a non-inferiority study with 2 active treatments, and at the end of the study we show they're the same, we've proven only one of 2 things, that they both work or that neither worked. So we require a superiority design, so that cannot be a problem with the study interpretation. We require evidence of a superiority effect. Sometimes the effect that we see is kind of small, but again, these people are getting rescued because otherwise they will not stay in the study. So if you think about the study design, and we're always open to more recommendations on how we can improve this, these are some of the challenges that we face and how we've evolved the study of analgesics to try and get some of these different concepts in place.
All right, well, I want to thank our colleagues and sponsors from the FDA, and I'm sorry, I know you've been standing there a long time, but we have got to get ourselves, back on schedule. So what I want to do is we're going to sort of basically not have a break, but during the time that people are moving and coming to the podium here, if people want to stretch and do whatever they need to do it, but we're going to kind of get back on